Have you ever noticed how, seemingly overnight, the entirety of Hollywood seemed to collectively shrink? It was the award season of late 2022 and early 2023, and the red carpets were looking starkly different. Celebrities who had built their brands on relatability, body positivity, or just having normal, fluctuating human figures were suddenly stepping out in gowns and tailored suits looking drastically, astonishingly thin. There was a noticeable hollow in the cheeks, a look that would soon be dubbed Ozempic face, and a sudden collective silence about how this transformation was achieved. When pressed by interviewers, the answers were always the same tired Hollywood cliches: drinking more water, doing Pilates, hiking in the Hollywood Hills, or eliminating dairy. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. We had seen decades of crash diets, juice cleanses, and grueling workout regimens. But this was entirely different. This was rapid, uniform, and seemingly effortless. The secret, which started as a whisper in exclusive Beverly Hills dermatology clinics and high-end med spas, quickly leaked to the masses. It wasn't a new treadmill routine or a magical macrobiotic diet. It was a weekly injection. It was a drug meant for type 2 diabetes. It was Ozempic. The cultural explosion of this drug is something we haven't seen in the pharmaceutical world since the introduction of Prozac in the late 1980s, or Viagra in the 1990s. Almost overnight, the word, quote, "one" became a generic trademark, a catch-all term for a new class of GLP-1 receptor agonists that were melting away fat at a rate previously only thought possible through invasive bariatric surgery. TikTok videos under the hashtag Ozempic skyrocketed into the billions of views. Influencers were live streaming their injection days, tracking their nausea, and showing off their shrinking waistlines. But alongside the sheer marvel of this medical breakthrough came a darker reality. As demand from the wealthy and the desperate surged, the global supply chain buckled. Actual type 2 diabetics, the very people the drug was invented to save, found themselves walking up to pharmacy counters only to be turned away. The shelves were empty. A drug designed to prevent kidney failure, blindness, and cardiovascular collapse in diabetics was being hoarded by those trying to drop 10 pounds for a wedding or a summer vacation. To truly understand how we arrived at this unprecedented moment in medical and cultural history, we have to rewind the clock. We have to strip away the glamour of Hollywood, ignore the viral TikTok dances, and travel back decades before anyone had ever heard of a __quote _2__. We need to go to a place where glamour is fundamentally absent, a cold, clinical laboratory in Denmark in the 1980s. Where scientists were quite literally looking at laundry detergent to find answers. Our story begins with the Danish pharmaceutical giant Novo Nordisk. Today, Novo Nordisk is a titan. Because of the explosive success of Ozempic and its sister drug Wegovy, Novo Nordisk recently became the most valuable company in Europe, with a market capitalization that eclipsed the entire gross domestic product of its home country of Denmark. But back in the late 1980s, While they were a respected player in the insulin market, they were far from the cultural monolith they are today. At the time, Novo Nordisk was involved in an array of scientific endeavors, including an industrial division that made enzymes for products like laundry detergent. Enter Lotte Beer Knutsen. If there is a singular hero in the origin story of Ozempic, it is her. Knutsen was not a celebrity doctor, she was a hard-working, brilliant scientist who originally studied chemical engineering. When she joined Novo Nordisk in 1989, she actually started out working on those very laundry detergents, helping to discover an enzyme that could remove the microscopic pills of cotton that build up on clothing after repeated wear. It was fascinating work, but Knutsen had a deeper ambition. She wanted to create medicines that changed human lives. When she transitioned to the medical research side of the company, she found herself plunged into a quest that had baffled scientists for roughly a century: the mystery of the incretin effect. To appreciate the sheer genius of what Knutsen and her team eventually accomplished, we have to take a brief detour into the human gut. As far back as 1906, researchers in Liverpool noticed something peculiar. If they took an extract from the intestines and injected it, it seemed to lower blood sugar. Interest in this waned when insulin was discovered in 1921. Insulin was the miracle cure, the silver bullet that saved type 1 diabetics from a rapid death. But by the 1960s, scientists noticed another strange phenomenon. If you give a person glucose intravenously, their body releases a certain amount of insulin. But if you give them the exact same amount of glucose orally, meaning they drink it and it passes through their stomach and intestines, their body releases a massively larger amount of insulin. This proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the gut was doing something active. The gut was acting as a sensory organ. When food hit the digestive tract, the intestines were sending a hormonal signal to the pancreas screaming __, quote, _3, __. These signaling hormones were named incretins. The race was on to identify these incretins. If scientists could isolate the hormone that told the pancreas to make insulin, they could give it to type 2 diabetics whose bodies had become resistant to insulin and whose pancreases were struggling to keep up, and help them control their blood sugar. Eventually, researchers identified a hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1, or GLP-1. GLP-1 was the magic key. When food enters the gut, GLP-1 is released. It travels to the pancreas to stimulate insulin. It travels to the liver to suppress glucagon, which prevents the liver from releasing stored sugar. And, crucially for our story, it travels to the brain to signal satiety, essentially telling your brain, quote, "4", while simultaneously slowing down the emptying of the stomach, so you actually stay full longer. It sounded like the perfect drug. There was just one massive, seemingly insurmountable problem. Natural GLP-1, when injected into the human body, has a half-life of about 2 minutes. The body contains an enzyme called DPP-4 that aggressively hunts down and shreds GLP-1, almost the instant it is produced. Nature designed it this way so that you don't stop eating forever after one meal. But for pharmaceutical scientists, this was a nightmare. You can't treat a diabetic with a drug that vanishes in 120 seconds. You would have to hook them up to a continuous intravenous drip 24 hours a day, which is entirely impractical. Throughout the early 1990s, the brightest minds in pharmaceuticals tried to solve this problem, and nearly all of them failed. They tried to create synthetic pills, but the molecules just weren't acting like drugs. The industry grew frustrated. In 1994, when Lotte Beer Knutsen returned from maternity leave, she walked into a disheartening scene. The entire research team she had been working with at Novo Nordisk had been reassigned or had left. The company was essentially writing off the GLP-1 project. The prevailing wisdom was that making an injectable peptide that could survive the body's digestive enzymes for more than a few minutes was a pipe dream. Many of her colleagues went back to the enzyme division to work on safer bets. But Knutsen refused to let it go. She believed in the biology of GLP-1. She knew the mechanism was sound, the chemistry just needed to catch up. She convinced her superiors to let her keep a small team to pursue this white whale. While Knutsen and her small team in Denmark were painstakingly testing thousands of molecular variations, a bizarre and completely unexpected breakthrough happened thousands of miles away in the American Southwest. A researcher named Dr. John Eng, working at the Bronx VA Medical Center, had a peculiar hobby. He liked to study the venoms of poisonous animals. He ordered the venom of the Gila monster, a slow-moving, venomous lizard native to the deserts of the southwestern United States and Mexico. The Gila monster has a fascinating metabolism. It eats only a few large meals a year and spends the rest of its time conserving energy. Dr. Eng discovered a hormone in the lizard's venomous saliva that he named Exendin-4. To his absolute shock, Exendin-4 was remarkably similar in structure to human GLP-1. But because it came from a lizard, the human enzyme DPP-4 didn't recognize it, meaning the enzyme didn't destroy it. When injected into humans, this lizard spit hormone stayed active for hours instead of minutes, effectively lowering blood sugar. This discovery led to a partnership with the pharmaceutical company Amylin, and eventually the creation of the drug exenatide, marketed as Byetta. It was a massive breakthrough. Approved by the FDA in 2005, Byetta was the world's first GLP-1 receptor agonist. But it had its drawbacks. It required patients to inject themselves twice a day, every single day. And because it was fundamentally a lizard protein, the human immune system sometimes recognized it as a foreign invader and created antibodies against it, reducing its effectiveness over time. Back in Denmark, Novo Nordisk watched the development of Byetta closely, but they had made a strategic, stubborn decision. They were not going to use lizard proteins. They wanted to create a drug that was 99% identical to human GLP-1 to avoid immune system rejection. And their goal was far more ambitious than twice-daily injections. Knutsen's team wanted a drug that a patient only had to take once a day, and eventually once a week. How do you take a fragile human hormone that dies in 2 minutes and make it survive for a week? The answer lay in a masterclass of biochemical engineering. Knutsen's team realized they needed a bodyguard for the GLP-1 molecule. They decided to attach a fatty acid chain to the hormone. The idea was that when the drug was injected, the fatty acid would act like a molecular magnet, binding tightly to a protein in the human bloodstream called albumin. Albumin is a massive, stable protein that circulates in our blood for weeks. By hitching a ride on albumin, the GLP-1 molecule was physically shielded from the destructive DPP-4 enzymes. It circulated safely in the blood, slowly detaching in microscopic amounts to do its job on the pancreas and the brain over a long period. This breakthrough led to Novo Nordisk's first GLP-1 drug, liraglutide, branded as Victoza, which was approved in 2010. Victoza was a game changer. It was 97% identical to human GLP-1 and only required a single injection once a day. Diabetics taking Victoza saw their blood sugar levels stabilize dramatically. But doctors began noticing something else. Something that had been seen mildly with the lizard-derived Byetta, but was much more pronounced with Victoza. The patients weren't just managing their diabetes, they were losing weight, a lot of weight. For decades, the standard treatments for diabetes, notably insulin, notoriously caused weight gain. It was a cruel irony. Obesity is a primary driver of type 2 diabetes, yet the medicine to treat the disease often made the underlying cause worse. Now, for the first time, doctors had a drug that attacked the blood sugar and the weight simultaneously. Knutsen had actually anticipated this. From the very early days of her research, she suspected that if they could get the drug to penetrate slightly into the outer regions of the brain where appetite is regulated, it could serve a dual purpose. However, in the early 2000s, the pharmaceutical industry was terrified of weight loss drugs. The history of anti-obesity medications was a graveyard of disasters, from the amphetamines of the mid-20th century to the fen-phen scandal of the 1990s, which caused fatal heart valve damage. Obesity was still largely viewed by the medical establishment and insurance companies as a moral failing, a lack of willpower rather than a chronic metabolic disease. Proposing a multi-million-dollar clinical trial for a weight loss drug was career suicide. But as the data from Victoza rolled in, it became impossible to ignore. Patients were dropping 5%, 8%, sometimes 10% of their body weight. Novo Nordisk cautiously decided to test a higher dose of liraglutide specifically for obesity, eventually getting it approved under the brand name Saxenda in 2014. Saxenda proved the concept, but a daily injection was still a barrier for many, and the weight loss, while clinically significant, wasn't yet rivaling surgical options. The team needed to push the chemistry even further. Enter semaglutide. A brilliant team of chemists at Novo Nordisk, led by Jesper Lau and Thomas Kruse alongside Knutsen, set out to build the ultimate GLP-1 receptor agonist. They screened over 4,000 different molecules. They needed a fatty acid chain that bound to albumin even tighter than liraglutide, and they needed to subtly alter the amino acid sequence to make it practically bulletproof against digestive enzymes. What they engineered was a masterpiece of molecular design. By swapping out just 2 amino acids and attaching a highly specific complex spacer and fatty acid chain, they created a compound that had a half-life of 165 hours in humans. This was the Holy Grail, a single injection that would last an entire week. They called the compound Semaglutide. In 2017, the FDA approved it for the treatment of type 2 diabetes under the brand name Ozempic. When Ozempic hit the market, it was introduced with the typical pharmaceutical fanfare. Cheerful commercials featuring people managing their blood sugar while catchy 1970s pop songs played in the background. Oh, 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 Ozempic. It was incredibly effective for diabetes, and more importantly, massive cardiovascular outcome trials proved that it significantly reduced the risk of major heart events like strokes and heart attacks in diabetic patients. This alone would have cemented Ozempic as a blockbuster drug. But what happened next in the clinical trials for obesity would change the world forever. Novo Nordisk had set up a sweeping series of clinical trials for semaglutide specifically focused on weight loss, known as the STEP trials. When the data from the STEP 1 trial was unblinded and published in the New England Journal of Medicine in early 2021, shockwaves ripped through the medical community. The results were staggering. Participants taking a 2.4 milligram weekly dose of semaglutide, a higher dose than what was typically used for diabetes, lost an average of 15% of their body weight over 68 weeks. 1/3 of the participants lost more than 20% of their body weight. These were numbers that had never been seen in the history of pharmacological science. This was bypassing the realm of diet pills and entering the territory of gastric bypass surgery, but entirely contained within a tiny, virtually painless, weekly needle prick. The FDA rapidly approved this higher dose of semaglutide for chronic weight management in June 2021 under the brand name Wegovy. Novo Nordisk now had 2 identical drugs, Ozempic, lower dose for diabetes, and Wegovy, higher dose for obesity. The strategy was clear. Keep the brands separate to navigate the complex world of insurance coverage, as many insurers would gladly pay to treat diabetes, but stubbornly refused to pay a dime to treat obesity. But the market, driven by human nature and the relentless engine of social media, had other plans. Wegovy launched, and almost immediately demand outstripped supply. The manufacturing facilities simply could not produce the specialized pen injectors fast enough. As Wegovy became impossible to find, doctors, many catering to high-end clientele who could afford to pay out of pocket, began prescribing Ozempic off-label for weight loss. Off-label prescribing is entirely legal and common in medicine, but the scale at which this happened was unprecedented. This brings us back to the red carpets and the TikTok feeds. The perfect storm had formed. You had a drug with an almost miraculous efficacy profile. You had a post-pandemic society highly conscious of health and appearance. You had a social media landscape designed to make visual transformations go virally exponential. And you had a medical establishment that was finally, slowly, waking up to the biological reality that obesity is a chronic disease driven by hormones and genetics, not just a simple lack of willpower. But the rapid popularization of Ozempic exposed deep, ugly fractures in our society's relationship with weight, health, and class. Because insurance largely refused to cover Ozempic for off-label weight loss or Wegovy for obesity, the drugs became a luxury commodity. At roughly $1,000 a month out of pocket in the United States, the quote 7 became the ultimate status symbol. It was the designer handbag of pharmaceuticals. While wealthy housewives in gated communities and actors preparing for roles happily paid the premium to effortlessly shed 15 pounds, working-class diabetics were forced into agonizing situations. The national shortage meant that patients whose lives depended on semaglutide to keep their A1C levels from causing organ failure were driving from pharmacy to pharmacy in a panic, rationing their doses or being forced back onto older, less effective weight-gaining medications like insulin or sulfonylureas. The narrative in the media became fiercely polarized. On one side, patient advocates and endocrinologists hailed GLP-1s as a miracle that could quite literally reverse the global obesity epidemic, potentially saving millions of lives from the downstream effects of metabolic syndrome, heart disease, and sleep apnea. They argued that gatekeeping the drug as a quote, _8 medication ignored the harsh reality that obesity is the precursor to the disease. On the other side, critics pointed to the rampant vanity use, the dangerous messaging it sent to young people about body image, and the deeply unsettling prospect of a society dependent on a weekly pharmaceutical injection just to maintain a normal weight. Furthermore, stories began to emerge about the side effects. It wasn't just the mild nausea mentioned in the commercials. People were reporting profound gastrointestinal distress, severe vomiting, and a phenomenon where their stomachs effectively stopped emptying entirely, a condition known as gastroparesis. There were whispers of muscle loss, where patients weren't just losing fat, but crucial lean muscle mass, leaving them frail. And the most daunting question of all loomed over the entire craze. What happens when you stop taking it? Early data suggested a grim reality. When patients stopped the injections, the hunger returned with a vengeance, the biological set point reasserted itself, and the weight came rushing back, sometimes faster than it was lost. This wasn't a cure. It was a lifetime subscription model for thinness. As the calendar turned from 2023 to 2024, Novo Nordisk found itself in a position of unimaginable power and pressure. They were expanding factories at a breakneck pace, investing billions into new manufacturing lines to try and quench the insatiable thirst of the global market. The economic impact was so profound that it single-handedly kept the Danish economy out of a recession, artificially boosting the value of the Danish kroner and forcing the country's central bank to adjust its interest rates. A single molecule born from the venom of a lizard and refined in a laboratory by a scientist looking for a better laundry detergent had effectively restructured the economy of a sovereign nation. But the scientific journey of semaglutide was far from over. While the world focused on the shrinking waistlines of influencers, researchers were quietly running trials on the broader systemic effects of GLP-1 receptor agonists. They started noticing trends that defied explanation. Patients on Ozempic weren't just eating less food. They were reporting a sudden lack of interest in drinking alcohol. Some stopped biting their nails. Others found their compulsive online shopping habits vanishing. The drug, it seemed, was heavily modulating the brain's reward pathways and dopamine centers. Suddenly, scientists were asking, could semaglutide be the key to treating addiction? Could this be the cure for alcoholism, smoking, or even opioid dependency? The implications were staggering. Furthermore, clinical trials targeting specific organs began to yield miraculous data. The FLOW trial demonstrated that Ozempic could significantly slow the progression of chronic kidney disease in diabetics. Other studies hinted at profound benefits for the liver, specifically in treating metabolic-associated steatohepatitis, MASH, a condition that frequently leads to liver failure and has no approved cure. There were even early-stage trials looking at the drug's effect on systemic inflammation, suggesting it might have protective benefits against cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. The narrative was shifting again. Ozempic was no longer just a diabetes drug, nor was it merely a Hollywood weight loss shot. It was beginning to look like a master key to human metabolic health, a foundational therapy capable of reversing the widespread systemic inflammation caused by the modern Western diet. The story of Ozempic is a mirror held up to modern society. It reflects our brilliant scientific ingenuity, our relentless pursuit of physical perfection, our deep-seated biases regarding weight and willpower, and the complex, often ruthless economics of the healthcare industry. As we stand in 2026, the landscape continues to evolve rapidly. The pills are replacing the pens, generic competitors are looming in international markets, and the definition of what it means to be healthy is being rewritten on a cellular level. But to understand the true magnitude of what was happening in the mid-2020s, you have to realize that Novo Nordisk wasn't operating in a vacuum. You cannot have a market this lucrative, literally the holy grail of consumer medicine, a cure for the very concept of being overweight, without waking a sleeping giant. And in the world of metabolic medicine, there is no giant larger, older, or more formidable than Eli Lilly and Company. Based in Indianapolis, Eli Lilly is the bedrock of American diabetes care. They were the first company to mass-produce insulin in the 1920s, saving millions of lives and establishing a dynasty that lasted a century. For decades, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly engaged in a polite, highly profitable duopoly, trading blows in the insulin market. But when Novo Nordisk released Ozempic and Wegovy, fundamentally shifting the paradigm from managing blood sugar to actively eradicating obesity, Eli Lilly realized they were at risk of losing their crown. They needed a counterattack, and they needed it to be vastly superior to semaglutide. The scientists at Eli Lilly looked at Novo Nordisk's GLP-1 success and asked a terrifyingly ambitious question. What if one hormone isn't enough? What if we could mimic two hormones at the exact same time? They focused on another incretin hormone called GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. Historically, GIP had been written off by obesity researchers. Early studies suggested that GIP actually promoted fat storage, which is the exact opposite of what you want in a weight loss drug. But the biochemists at Lilly discovered a paradoxical effect. When you combined a GIP receptor agonist with a GLP-1 receptor agonist, they didn't just add together, they synergized. The GIP seemed to supercharge the GLP-1, smoothing out the harsh gastrointestinal side effects like nausea, while simultaneously amplifying the fat-burning and appetite-suppressing effects to unprecedented levels. They engineered a single molecule that acted as a dual agonist, a twin creatine, unlocking both the GLP-1 and GIP receptors. They named this compound thiazepatide. When the clinical trial data for thiazepatide was released, the medical community, which was still reeling from the shock of Ozempic, had to collectively pick up its jaw from the floor. If Ozempic was a miracle, thiazepatide was science fiction. In the SURMOUNT-1 trial, patients taking the highest dose of thiazepatide lost an average of 22.5% of their body weight. Nearly 40% of the participants lost a quarter of their total body mass. These were numbers that didn't just rival bariatric surgery. In many cases, they surpassed it. Eli Lilly rapidly secured FDA approval for tirzepatide to treat type 2 diabetes under the brand name Mounjaro in 2022, and subsequently for obesity under the brand name Zepbound in late 2023. The pharma wars had officially begun. It was King Kong versus Godzilla, playing out in pharmacies and doctors' offices across the globe. Mounjaro and Zepbound were injected using an automatic spring-loaded pen that hid the needle, making it even more user-friendly than the Ozempic dial-a-dose pen. Patients began switching allegiances, seeking out the stronger, supposedly less nauseating dual agonist. As these two pharmaceutical titans clashed, pouring billions of dollars into direct-to-consumer advertising and aggressive lobbying efforts to force insurance companies to cover the drugs, a profound psychological phenomenon was being documented among the millions of people injecting these peptides. It was a concept that would quickly infiltrate the cultural lexicon: the eradication of food noise. For people who have never struggled with chronic obesity or binge eating disorder, the concept of food noise is almost impossible to understand. If you are naturally thin, you likely eat when you are hungry and stop when you are full. You don't think about a sandwich sitting in the refrigerator for 4 hours. You don't map out the locations of fast food drive-thrus on your commute home. You don't finish a massive dinner and immediately start obsessing over what the dessert will be. But for millions of people, this relentless, intrusive, high-volume internal monologue about food is a waking nightmare. It is a biological drive as loud and demanding as a person drowning, gasping for air. When patients took their first dose of Ozempic or Mounjaro, they didn't just feel physically full. Their brains went entirely silent. The food noise simply evaporated. For the first time in their lives, they could look at a plate of donuts in the office break room, acknowledge that they looked nice, and then walk away without a second thought. They could eat half a cheeseburger and genuinely feel like putting the rest in a to-go box. This psychological liberation was, for many, far more profound than the shrinking numbers on the scale. It proved what obesity researchers had been screaming into the void for decades. Obesity is not a character flaw. It is not a lack of willpower. It is a neurochemical mismatch in the brain's reward and satiety centers. You cannot out-willpower your own biology. But with a weekly injection, you could finally level the playing field. However, this medical miracle triggered a massive, unforeseen economic earthquake. By late 2023, Wall Street analysts started noticing bizarre anomalies in corporate data. The CEO of Walmart US gave an interview stating that the company, which tracks consumer purchasing data with terrifying precision, was noticing a slight but distinct pullback in the overall basket size of customers they knew were taking GLP-1 drugs. These customers were buying fewer high-calorie, high-margin junk foods. They were buying less soda, fewer chips, and smaller portions. Panic spread through the food and beverage industry. Stocks for companies that manufacture sugary snacks, fast food, and soda took a noticeable hit. If 10% to 20% of the global population eventually ended up on these drugs, the cumulative reduction in caloric intake would devastate the junk food business model. Food conglomerates frantically began holding emergency board meetings, scrambling to pivot their portfolios towards smaller portion sizes and higher protein, quote, 12 snack lines. The disruption didn't stop at the grocery store. Aviation analysts released reports calculating that if the average weight of airline passengers dropped by just 10 pounds due to widespread Ozempic use, airlines like United and Delta would save hundreds of millions of dollars a year in jet fuel costs. The medical device industry, specifically companies making CPAP machines for sleep apnea and knee replacement joints, saw their stock prices wobble as investors realized that a thinner population would need far fewer of these interventions. A single class of drugs was threatening to rewrite the entire macroeconomic landscape of consumerism and healthcare. Nowhere was this disruption more violent than in the commercial diet industry. For 60 years, companies like Weight Watchers, WW, and Jenny Craig had built multi-billion-dollar empires on the fundamental premise of calorie counting, point systems, and sheer willpower. Their entire business model relied on a cycle of failure. You sign up, you lose a little weight, you inevitably gain it back because your biology fights the calorie deficit, and then you sign up again next January. Ozempic broke that cycle overnight. Jenny Craig, unable to adapt to the new reality, filed for bankruptcy and closed its doors in 2023, a staggering casualty of the GLP-1 era. Weight Watchers, on the other hand, executed one of the most drastic, desperate pivots in corporate history. Recognizing that they could not beat the drugs, they bought a telehealth company called Sequence for over $100 million. They fundamentally changed their messaging, apologizing for decades of pushing the willpower narrative, and transitioned into a prescription mill, helping their members get access to Ozempic and Wegovy. The legacy diet industry was dead. The medical weight loss industry had absorbed it whole. But where there is desperate demand and tightly controlled, wildly expensive supply, a black market will inevitably rise. And the Ozempic black market became the Wild West of modern medicine. Because the FDA officially listed semaglutide and tirzepatide as being in shortage, a little-known regulatory loophole was activated. This loophole allows specialized facilities known as compounding pharmacies to create their own generic versions of patented drugs as long as the official shortage persists. The intention of this law is noble. If a hospital runs out of a life-saving chemotherapy drug, a compounding pharmacy can whip up a batch to save the patient. But in the context of the greatest weight loss craze in human history, this loophole became a multi-billion-dollar gold rush. Almost overnight, the internet was flooded with telehealth startups, Instagram ads, and shady wellness clinics offering compounded semaglutide for a fraction of the cost of the name brand pens. For $200 or $300 a month, a virtually unseen doctor would approve a prescription and a vial of clear liquid would arrive at your doorstep in a styrofoam cooler packed with dry ice, alongside a bag of insulin syringes. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly were furious. They launched a scorched earth legal campaign suing compounding pharmacies, medical spas, and wellness clinics across the country. They argued that these compounded versions were unauthorized, untested, and potentially dangerous. And they weren't entirely wrong. While many highly regulated 503B compounding pharmacies were producing sterile, identical copies of the drug, the massive demand attracted bad actors. The FDA began receiving reports of patients being hospitalized after injecting themselves with fake Ozempic. Investigators discovered a terrifying grey market pipeline. Because the active pharmaceutical ingredients, APEs, for semaglutide and tirzepatide are essentially just chains of amino acids, peptides, unregulated chemical factories in China began mass-producing the raw powder. They would sell this powder online as __quote _16__. Desperate consumers, priced out of the legitimate healthcare system and unable to afford the compounded versions, were buying these raw, untested vials of white powder off the internet. They were mixing the powder with bacteriostatic water on their kitchen counters, calculating the microgram dosages themselves using online forums and Reddit threads, and injecting it into their own stomachs. The risks were astronomical. Some of these imported powders were found to be contaminated with heavy metals, bacteria, or completely different substances altogether. There were horror stories of people severely overdosing because they misunderstood the math required to reconstitute a peptide, sending them into severe hypoglycemic shock or days of uncontrollable, violent vomiting. Poison control centers saw an exponential spike in calls related to semaglutide overdoses. The quote 17 had birthed an underground drug culture that operated with the intensity and secrecy of illicit narcotics, all driven by the societal pressure to achieve a certain body type. This societal pressure brings us to perhaps the most complex and painful cultural fallout of the Ozempic era: the absolute fracturing of the body positivity movement. For the past decade, a massive cultural shift had been underway. The body positivity and fat acceptance movements fought tirelessly to decouple thinness from moral virtue and health. Activists, plus-size models and influencers built massive followings preaching self-love at any size, fighting against weight discrimination in the workplace and the medical field. They argued with significant scientific backing that BMI is a flawed metric and that health can exist across a spectrum of body sizes. Then came the GLP-1s. Suddenly, prominent figures in the body positivity space began to quietly, rapidly shrink. Some were honest about their use of the drugs, stating that they were suffering from severe health issues like prediabetes or joint pain and had made a private medical decision to seek treatment. Others lied by omission, attributing their massive weight loss to, quote, 18 or engaging in, quote, 19, gaslighting their audiences in the exact same way traditional Hollywood celebrities were doing. The betrayal felt by the fat acceptance community was palpable. For years, these influencers had built their personal brands and immense wealth by telling marginalized, overweight people that they were perfect exactly as they were, that diets were a capitalist scam, and that intentional weight loss was rooted in anti-fat bias. Now, the moment a relatively easy, highly effective chemical solution became available to them, they abandoned the movement and bought into the very thin ideal they had spent their careers dismantling. It sparked vicious, heartbreaking debates online. Is taking Ozempic a betrayal of body positivity? Or is body positivity about bodily autonomy? Meaning a person should have the right to alter their body chemistry without judgment. Many argued that the mass adoption of these drugs proved that the body positivity movement, for all its noble intentions, was largely a coping mechanism for a society that lacked effective medical interventions for obesity. It revealed a harsh truth. Many people who loudly proclaimed they loved being fat only did so because they believed they had no other viable choice. The moment the choice was presented in the form of a weekly injection, the ideology crumbled under the weight of societal privilege and the undeniable, tangible benefits of existing in a smaller body in a profoundly fat-phobic world. This cultural dissonance extended into the doctors' offices. The medical community was deeply divided on how to prescribe these medications ethically. You had pediatricians grappling with the moral weight of prescribing Wegovy to 12-year-olds. The clinical data showed that treating childhood obesity early with GLP-1s drastically improved their long-term health trajectories, practically eliminating their risk of developing type 2 diabetes as teenagers. But critics, horrified by this practice, argued that we were chemically altering the metabolic development of children rather than fixing the broken, highly processed food environments that were causing the obesity in the first place. Are we essentially putting kids on a permanent, expensive pharmaceutical subscription to survive the American food system? And then there was the aesthetic market, the so-called vanity prescriptions. Plastic surgeons and dermatologists began offering Ozempic alongside Botox and lip fillers. Brides-to-be were acquiring prescriptions to drop 10 pounds before their weddings. The term Ozempic face became a viral phenomenon. Because the weight loss was so rapid, the fat pads in the face depleted quickly, leaving many users with a gaunt, hollowed-out, prematurely aged appearance. Ironically, this created a secondary boom for plastic surgeons, who were now being paid thousands of dollars to inject dermal fillers back into the faces of patients who had paid thousands of dollars to lose the fat in the first place. The Ouroboros of modern vanity was perfectly complete. Yet, despite the superficial circus surrounding the drug, the hard science was quietly marching forward, uncovering layers of biological impact that no one had predicted. The GLP-1 receptors weren't just in the gut, the pancreas, and the appetite centers of the hypothalamus. They were found all over the body. They were in the heart, the kidneys, the immune system, and widespread throughout the central nervous system. Researchers began to realize that GLP-1 was fundamentally an anti-inflammatory hormone. Obesity is largely recognized by the body as a state of chronic, low-grade systemic inflammation. This inflammation damages blood vessels, impairs organ function, and accelerates aging. When patients took semaglutide or tirzepatide, markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein, CRP, plummeted, often before significant weight loss even occurred. This anti-inflammatory mechanism opened up a Pandora's box of medical possibilities. In massive clinical trials like the SELECT trial, Novo Nordisk proved that Wegovy reduced the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes by 20% in overweight patients who did not have diabetes. This was the holy grail. It proved definitively to insurance companies that obesity medication wasn't a cosmetic luxury, it was a life-saving preventative intervention. Covering the cost of Wegovy was ultimately cheaper than paying for a patient's open-heart surgery 5 years down the line. But the anti-inflammatory effects in the brain were perhaps the most exciting frontier of all. Neuroscientists looking at the devastating progression of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease noted that these conditions are heavily driven by neuroinflammation and insulin resistance in the brain. Alzheimer's is often referred to by researchers as __22__. Early-stage clinical trials began investigating whether GLP-1 agonists could cross the blood-brain barrier, reduce this neuroinflammation, and halt or even reverse cognitive decline. The anecdotal reports were already trickling in, patients on Mounjaro and Ozempic reporting a sudden lifting of __23__ improved memory retention and sharper focus. If these drugs prove effective in halting Alzheimer's, their legacy will transcend weight loss entirely. They will be remembered as the drugs that saved the aging human mind. As we navigated the mid-2020s, the pharmaceutical pipeline became a relentless arms race. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly were no longer the only players in the game. Every major pharmaceutical company on earth, Amgen, Pfizer, Boehringer Ingelheim, AstraZeneca, was frantically pouring billions into developing the next generation of metabolic drugs. The goal was no longer just matching Ozempic. The goal was rendering it obsolete. The future was moving in two distinct directions: extreme efficacy and extreme convenience. On the efficacy front, Eli Lilly was already developing the successor to tirzepatide. If two hormones were better than one, why not three? They developed a triple G agonist called retetrutide, which targeted GLP-1, GIP, and a third hormone called glucagon. The glucagon receptor activation was the missing piece of the puzzle. While GLP-1 and GIP reduced appetite and boosted insulin, glucagon actually increased basal metabolic rate. It forced the body to burn more calories even while resting. In early trials, retetrutide yielded a jaw-dropping 24% weight loss in just 48 weeks, with many patients losing 30% of their body weight. Furthermore, it completely resolved fatty liver disease in over 85% of trial participants within months. It was a molecular bulldozer clearing out metabolic dysfunction. On the convenience front, the race was on to ditch the needle entirely. While weekly injections were a massive leap forward from daily shots, a vast percentage of the global population is fundamentally needle-phobic. For these drugs to truly reach 1 billion people globally, they needed to be in pill form. Creating an oral peptide was notoriously difficult. Remember, the stomach acid and digestive enzymes are designed to destroy proteins instantly. But Novo Nordisk achieved a breakthrough with an oral version of semaglutide, marketed for diabetes as Rybelsus, using a specialized absorption enhancer called SNAC that essentially created a localized protective bubble in the stomach lining, allowing the drug to pass into the bloodstream. Eli Lilly was close behind with a non-peptide small molecule GLP-1 pill called orforglipron, which could survive the stomach entirely and be manufactured vastly cheaper than the injectable pens. We were rapidly approaching a future where treating obesity and metabolic disease wouldn't involve a specialized refrigerated pen and a needle, but simply taking a cheap daily pill alongside your morning vitamins. The implications of this future are both utopian and deeply unsettling. On one hand, we are looking at the potential eradication of the greatest public health crisis of the 21st century. The downstream effects of curing obesity would be miraculous. Plummeting rates of certain cancers, massive reductions in heart disease, millions of people freed from the mechanical joint pain that keeps them immobile. We could see global life expectancies tick upward for the first time in decades. But on the other hand, we are hurtling toward a medicated society. What does it mean for human evolution if our primary method of surviving the hypercaloric environment we have built is to universally alter our gastrointestinal hormones? Are we giving a free pass to the ultra-processed food industry, allowing them to continue pumping out addictive, nutritionally void garbage because we now have a pharmaceutical antidote to fix the damage they cause? And what happens to the social fabric of a world where thinness can be bought? As long as these drugs remain expensive and gate-kept by private insurance, we risk creating a biological caste system. The wealthy will have access to effortless thinness, longevity, and metabolic health, while the poor are left to navigate food deserts and skyrocketing rates of chronic disease, further stigmatized because their obesity is now viewed not just as a failure of willpower, but as a failure of capital. An inability to afford the cure. The history of Ozempic is not just a medical chronicle, it is a profound sociological mirror. It forces us to confront the darkest corners of our vanity, the predatory nature of our food supply, the incredible genius of biochemical engineering, and the deeply flawed, profit-driven mechanisms of our healthcare systems. As we peer over the precipice of the mid-2020s and look toward the horizon of the 2030s, the narrative of Ozempic shifts from a story of acute medical intervention to one of global evolutionary consequence. The defining battle of the next decade will not be fought in the laboratories discovering new peptides. Those discoveries have already been made. The next battle is purely economic, and it is a battle for the democratization of human metabolism. Right now, the barrier to entry for biological thinness is capital. But in the pharmaceutical world, there is a ticking clock that haunts every major manufacturer. The patent cliff. The intellectual property rights that allow companies like Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly to charge astronomical premiums for semaglutide and thiazepatide are not infinite. By the early 2030s, the foundational patents protecting these molecules will begin to expire. And waiting in the wings are the massive, hyper-efficient generic pharmaceutical manufacturing sectors of India, China, and South America. When the patent cliff hits, we will witness the quote 25 We saw a preview of this with statins in the early 2000s. Once a drug that lowers cholesterol became generic, it became so incredibly cheap to produce that doctors practically put it in the drinking water. The cost of a month's supply of semaglutide could plummet from a staggering 4-figure luxury expense to the price of a daily cup of coffee. The implications of this are staggering. Entire national healthcare budgets currently buckling under the immense financial strain of treating end-stage diabetic kidney failure, performing thousands of amputations, and managing chronic cardiovascular disease could suddenly be reallocated. We are talking about the potential to eradicate clinical obesity on a global scale, making the disease of kings an artifact of medical history, much like scurvy or polio. But as the access to these drugs widens, the scientific community is racing to solve the darkest, most closely guarded secret of the GLP-1 revolution, the silent epidemic of muscle loss. When you see someone who has rapidly lost 50 pounds on Wegovy or Mounjaro, your brain registers the shrinking silhouette as health. But beneath the skin, a complex and somewhat alarming physiological triage has taken place. When the human body is placed in a massive caloric deficit, which these drugs effortlessly induce by silencing the brain's hunger centers and slowing gastric emptying, it does not exclusively burn adipose tissue, fat. It also scavenges for energy by breaking down lean muscle mass. In clinical trials, body composition scans revealed a troubling statistic. Up to 40% of the total weight lost by some patients on high-dose GLP-1 therapies was not fat, but lean muscle and bone density. In the medical field, the rapid involuntary loss of skeletal muscle is known as sarcopenia. For a 25-year-old taking the drug to drop a few dress sizes, losing some muscle might not seem catastrophic in the short term. But for a 65-year-old patient, losing 5 pounds of leg muscle can be the difference between living independently and falling, breaking a hip, and ending up in a nursing home. Muscle is our metabolic engine. It is our armor against aging. This muscle depletion creates a devastating mathematical trap for the patient. Let's look at the pharmacokinetics and metabolic reality. Muscle tissue is highly metabolically active. it burns calories just existing. If a patient loses a significant percentage of their lean muscle mass, their basal metabolic rate, BMR, inevitably plummets. If they ever decide to stop taking the weekly injection, they are hit with a biochemical double whammy. First, the drug leaves their system. The elimination of semaglutide follows first-order kinetics, governed by the exponential decay formula. Because semaglutide has an unusually long half-life of roughly 165 hours, it takes about 5 to 6 weeks for the drug to completely clear the bloodstream. Once it is gone, the neurological food noise comes rushing back, often louder than before, driven by the body's evolutionary panic response to starvation. But second, and far more insidiously, their metabolic engine has shrunk. They now require significantly fewer calories to maintain their weight than they did before they started the drug. The rebound weight gain is vicious, rapid, and mostly comprised of fat, leaving the patient with a worse body composition than when they started. This reality has triggered a secondary gold rush in the biotechnology sector. Pharmaceutical companies are now desperately trying to develop combination therapies that pair a GLP-1 agonist with a muscle-preserving agent. The most promising candidates are myostatin inhibitors. Myostatin is a protein produced by the body that actively tells muscle growth to stop. It is a biological brake pedal. By introducing a compound like bimagrumab, which binds to the ACTR2B receptors and blocks myostatin, scientists believe they can force the body to build or retain muscle even while the GLP-1 drug melts away the fat. The holy grail of the late 2020s is a single dual-chambered injection, one chemical to starve the fat cells and another to feed the muscle. Yet, beyond the vanity of weight loss and the mechanics of muscle retention, the most profound chapter of the Ozempic story is currently being written in the field of gerontology, the study of aging. To understand why a diabetes drug might hold the key to human longevity, we have to look deeply into the cellular architecture of how we age. For decades, longevity researchers have known that the most effective way to extend the lifespan of almost any organism, from yeast to fruit flies to mice, is caloric restriction. If you feed an animal 30% fewer calories while maintaining necessary micronutrients, it will live significantly longer and remain disease-free for a greater portion of its life. But why? The mechanism centers around nutrient-sensing pathways in our cells, specifically the insulin/IGF-1 signaling pathway, and a crucial protein complex known as the mechanistic target of rapamycin, or mTOR. Think of mTOR as a cellular contractor. When food, especially protein and carbohydrates, is abundant, insulin spikes and mTOR is activated. mTOR tells the cell, quote, 29, but continuous cellular growth accelerates aging and the accumulation of cellular damage. Conversely, when calories are scarce, insulin drops, and an energy-sensing enzyme called AMPK is activated. AMPK shuts down mTOR and triggers a process called autophagy. Autophagy is the cell's internal housekeeping protocol. The cell literally eats its own damaged organelles, clears out misfolded proteins, and repairs its DNA. Humans are terrible at caloric restriction. We lack the willpower to starve ourselves for the promise of a longer life. But semaglutide and thiazepatide chemically simulate a state of fasting. By drastically lowering blood glucose spikes, increasing insulin sensitivity, and reducing overall caloric intake, these drugs fundamentally alter the nutrient-sensing environment of the human body. They quiet the insulin/IGF-1 pathway and downregulate mTOR, effectively tricking the cells into initiating the life-extending maintenance protocols of autophagy without the psychological torture of actual starvation. The early epidemiological data is breathtaking. We are seeing indications that chronic systemic inflammation, the underlying driver of arterial plaque, joint degradation, and cellular senescence, is being rapidly quelled by GLP-1 receptor activation. The implications of the SELECT cardiovascular trial cannot be overstated. By reducing major cardiovascular events by 20%, semaglutide is doing more than protecting the heart. It is fundamentally slowing the rate at which our vascular system ages. If future long-term human trials confirm that these incretin mimetics delay the onset of age-related neurodegeneration, cardiovascular collapse, and metabolic decline, Ozempic will not be remembered as a weight loss drug. It will be remembered alongside penicillin and vaccines as one of the ultimate biological paradigm shifts. We are looking at a compound that could realistically push the average human health span, the period of life spent free from chronic disease, deep into the 80s and 90s. But this utopian vision brings us face to face with a profound evolutionary paradox. Human beings are the product of millions of years of brutal, unforgiving natural selection. For 99.9% of our history on this planet, the greatest threat to our survival was starvation. Our ancestors survived the ice ages, droughts, and famines because they possessed the thrifty genotype. Those who could gorge on calorie-dense foods when they were occasionally available efficiently convert those calories into visceral and subcutaneous fat and tightly hold on to that fat during long periods of famine were the ones who lived long enough to reproduce. You and I are the descendants of the best fat storers in human history. Our brains are hardwired to release a massive hit of dopamine when we consume sugar and fat, because historically, finding a honeycomb or a fatty animal carcass was a massive evolutionary victory. But in the span of roughly a single century, a mere microscopic blip on the evolutionary timeline, we completely altered our environment. We industrialized agriculture. We invented high fructose corn syrup, refined seed oils, and the drive-through window. We created a world of absolute, unyielding caloric abundance, engineered by food scientists specifically to bypass our natural satiety signals and hijack our ancient dopamine pathways. Our environment changed at the speed of technology, but our genetics remained stuck in the Pleistocene epoch. The obesity epidemic is not a sudden collective loss of human willpower. It is the violent collision of ancient biology and modern capitalism. The human body is behaving exactly as it was designed to behave. It is storing excess energy for a famine that, in the developed world, never comes. The invention of Ozempic and the subsequent GLP-1 revolution represent the ultimate triumph and perhaps the ultimate tragedy of the Anthropocene. We have effectively admitted defeat. We have acknowledged that we cannot or will not fix the broken food environment we have created. We are not going to dismantle the multi-trillion-dollar ultra-processed food industry. We are not going to return to a life of agrarian physical labor. We have built an environment that is fundamentally toxic to our ancient biology. And so, we used our unparalleled scientific genius to engineer a chemical hack. We took the venom of a desert lizard and the obscure digestive hormones of the human gut, reverse engineered their molecular structure, and created a synthetic shield against our own environment. We built a drug to protect us from the very world we built. As you look around today, you are witnessing the dawn of a new biological era. The distinction between the wealthy, medicated and thin versus the impoverished, unmedicated and metabolically sick is a stark reminder of the immense work left to do regarding global healthcare equity. But the science itself is undeniably miraculous. Lotte Beer Knutsen, the scientist who stubbornly refused to abandon a fragile peptide that vanished in 2 minutes, fundamentally altered the trajectory of human health. The story of Ozempic is a testament to the fact that while human beings are exceptionally good at creating massive, complex problems for ourselves, we are also incredibly, astonishingly adept at inventing the tools to survive them.